everyone. This is Deanna Minnick. Welcome to the Detox Summit. Today, we're interviewing Dr. Martha Herbert. Dr. Herbert is an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, and she's a pediatric neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. She's also an affiliate of the Harvard MIT MGH Martineau Center for Biomedical Imaging, where she's the director of the Transcend Research Program. And Transcend is an acronym for Treatment, Research, and Neuroscience Evaluation of Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Dr. Herbert earned her medical degree at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. Before that, she obtained her doctoral degree at the University of California, Santa Cruz, studying evolution and development of learning processes in biology and culture in the History of Consciousness program. As if that weren't enough, she went on to do some postdoctoral work in the philosophy and history of science. She trained in pediatrics at Cornell University Medical Center and in neurology and child neurology at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where she has remained. She's received the first Cure Autism Now Innovator Award and is now on the Scientific Advisory Committee of Autism Speaks. Her background in pediatric neurology, evolutionary biology, and history of science has oriented her towards systems biology. We've been hearing a lot from the various speakers within the summit on functional medicine. Systems biology is the same. We're really looking at the interconnection of the different body systems. So what we're going to have in this interview is Dr. Herbert really helping us to understand the landscape of the brain and whether or not the brain is protected from toxins and toxicity. How do we protect our brain? How do toxins come into things like behavior and especially autism? One of her books that I have, in fact, I have it right here with me. It's called The Autism Revolution, Whole Body Strategies for Making Life All It Can Be. Welcome, Dr. Herbert, to the Detox Summit.
Thank you so much, Deanna.
What an accomplished woman you are. You are definitely one of my role models. And as part of this summit, I kind of get goosebumps on this because we've had so many amazing women who are so distinguished, so expert in their field, multiple degrees, high knowledge base. So here we are bringing you in to really distill down some of your complex wisdom. And I know that this is going to be a phenomenal interview. So as we jump in here, why don't we first start by getting to know you a little bit better? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your background, maybe some personal tidbits as it relates to your journey with health and healing, and anything specific to toxins that you feel is relevant within your own personal history.
Sure. Well, I've been through a lot of different things that have changed. There's a point where you think you know a lot, and then you get hit with things that you didn't really, that were even worse than what you thought. Like one of my favorite comedians, oh my goodness, what is her name? She said, she was on the Saturday Night Live show, and it'll come to me in a minute.
Is it Lily Tomlin?
Yeah, Lily Tomlin.
Okay.
She's my hero or whatever. She said, no matter how cynical you get, it's just impossible to keep up. And I've sort of lived that at various points in my life. I grew up in Lower Manhattan, which at the time I lived there was pretty filthy. You could see the swirling blue smoke on the street. As I walked to school, there was incredible dust all the time. My parents were smokers. And I had asthma. And in my teens and then again in my 20s, I moved to California. And then the second time around, it was to Santa Cruz. And I started discovering the outdoors. And I had a very interesting experience having an asthma attack on a surfboard and thinking like I was going to die, which I really could have. And then reliving it in some therapy processes that I was going through in a very intensive, cathartic thing. And I got rid of my asthma. It was a remarkable experience for me. I've never had asthma since. And that was decades ago. And that was one of the things that happened to me that made me think that healing is a real process. It's really beyond what you thought. A lot of other things changed. I became much more organized. Another thing that happened to me back then was I used to have a lot of urinary tract infections and get antibiotics almost every month. And then I had an acupuncture set of treatments, and it all went away for several years. I realized that from these things that there's an interaction between things from the outside that may make you sick and things that are going on in you that can get you better or that have to do with how vulnerable you are. Um, and I've been through some more things, but that would be a longer story considering we have a lot to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But and then when I got involved in the autism world, I began to realize that the things that I had been told about this being a brain disorder, a hardwired thing in the brain, really weren't true because I was watching people get sicker and also get better and get all the way better from taking care of their health. And I wrote a paper in 2005, Is Autism a Brain Disorder or a Disorder that Affects the Brain? And I really think that we have to remember that our brains are wet, living organs made up of cells and fluids in our heads. They're not just computers with wires. Nothing is really hardwired. The idea of hardwired is a myth. And once you understand the living universe of all these cells and how they help each other, you get a very, very different picture of what you can do from illness and from how to get better from illness, and that includes toxicity.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And even in your book, you say that no one is free of toxins.
Possible. It's like painful to realize it. I mean, it's one of those Lily Tomlin, what my friends, because they know I love that Lily Tomlin quote, call Lily Tomlin moments. You go through this series of painful awakenings when you realize that you're toxic and that it isn't trivial, and that even if you tried, you couldn't have completely avoided it. And it's a very painful awakening. And I think one of the problems in the medical system is that a lot of the people who practice haven't gone through that process. And so they don't really take account of the accumulation of a toxic body burden and how that biases the system to vulnerability and how you need to address it. So, as we go through this process, we have to learn to be more reliant upon ourselves and upon the resources and the new institutions that we create to really handle the magnitude of the problems that we're facing.
That's right. And that really gets to empowerment. That as everybody is listening to this, really feeling the ability based on all this information to really feel like you have what you need to be empowered to make steps in the direction of health and wellness. So let's dive into the brain. Give us just some quick facts about the brain that probably many people won't realize. You already mentioned that it's a very fluid organ. I think many of us think of it just as like gray putty. It's just this matter that sits there and it's kind of static, but that's not what I'm hearing from you.
Now, I can give you several facts. First of all, it's definitely not static, and you can look to the osteopathic tradition where they learn how to palpate these subtle rhythms that are not the heart rate, not the breathing rate, but there's a physical oscillation of cells and fluids, which we're increasingly able to measure not only in the brain, but in other organs as well. This has to do with many things, including pumping stuff in and out of different cellular and subcellular regions. Recently, a study was published in Science magazine. The first author was Xie, Xie, and the last author was Niedergang. And this had to do with two things, sleep and glial cells. So first I have to tell you about glial cells. Glial cells outnumber neurons between 4-1 to 10-1, but people are just starting to talk about them. They used to be written off as the housekeeping cells of the brain or the glue of the brain. But now it turns out that they do incredibly important things. And there was a very interesting Women's Study History of Science paper showing that back in the days when people thought glial cells didn't do much, they were talked about in the feminine gender. And interestingly, as the more they're shown to play very important roles in the brain, the more they're using the male gender to refer to them. But I think, that's a kind of a sad commentary. That glial cells nourish the neurons. They do vital metabolic functions for the neurons that the neurons almost had to outsource in order to specialize so much in sending electrical signals. The neurons couldn't do anything without the glial cells, without the blood vessels around them, without the stuff called the extracellular matrix, which is the stuff in between all of the cells. And another type of cell that people know something about but not enough is the microglial cell, which they wander around the brain. They're immune cells in the brain.
You
So
know,
when you have toxicity,
Mhm.
these cells are very, very involved.
So definitely some new terms here for all of us to be aware of. We do think of, typically when we think of the brain, we think of nerve cells or neurons, but there's a lot of delineation and distinction within that category, and a lot of different other cells. The glial cells, as you're mentioning, that nourish the neurons are something that we have to pay attention to. And as you're saying, and I think this is one of those other concepts that probably many people don't realize, that the brain has an immune component, that it has this immune function. It has cells within it that are gauging immune response. So, how do toxins come into these cell types that you're describing? How do they impact their function? And also, what happens to the immune system in the brain as a result of these toxins?
Toxins and infections activate these glial cells. They go from a resting state to an activated state to be on high alert to protect the brain. Astrocytes have been described as the trash collectors of the brain. So if you start getting garbage in the brain or toxic substances or heavy metals, the astrocytes try to sequester them, to chow them down. But they're just little cells, and there's only so much garbage that they can sequester. And at some point, they can't sequester anymore, and their functioning starts to break down. There's some interesting work on stimulation of the ability of these stuffed up astrocytes to be actually able to take out the trash. And if you nutritionally stimulate the system, you can actually there have been picture study, I have some up on my website, of astrocytes actually stuffed up with breakdown products of trash, sidling up to blood vessels and dumping the stuff into the blood system to get it out. But that's not going to happen if you're nutritionally depleted, because you won't have the resources to get the cells to perform that function. And they're just going to get stuffed up and sick, and the whole system is going to start to degenerate. And we call that aging. And when you look at people who engage in habits such as alcoholism, which is a toxic activity, it's not an industrial toxin, but it's definitely a toxin. Those people experience premature aging of the brain. Toxicity does that, but the reason it does that is that all the reparative processes of the brain are overtaxed by the toxin, and the brain can't keep up. So it ages.
Now, I just want to clarify on that point, because I think, again, within nutrition, we get mixed messages. And the message that has been disseminated is drink red wine, that may, in fact, have some anti-aging ability in our body. If we look at the Blue Zones work from Dan Buettner, this red wine that is rich with polyphenol. So are you talking about red wine as even being a toxin? Is there a threshold where it becomes a toxin? Or what's your take on alcohol in general as it relates to the brain and the health of the brain?
You can't make generalizations about where the threshold is for every single one of us in the same way. Some of us are much closer to the edge of vulnerability than others of us. I like to use the model of, well, the technical term is allostatic load, but let's call it total load. That means the total pileup of all the physical and emotional and psychological and electromagnetic and radiation stressors that you've been exposed to that you haven't been able to recover or clear out. And so you have the total load of burdens, and then you have what your resources are, your resiliency. And your vulnerability to being toxic is your resourcefulness minus the total burden. So if your resources are depleted, if you burned yourself at both ends and you haven't built yourself back up, it won't take much for you to take a hit from a toxic exposure, whether that be alcohol or heavy metals or pesticides or toxic household products.
Mm-hmm.
So the big issue is, are you maintaining your ability to have your cells carry out repair processes? And the way you do that is basically what I talked about in my book: high nutrient density food, avoiding any avoidable toxic exposures, protecting your healthy bugs in your gut and avoiding infections, and keeping your stress down, which involves getting plenty of sleep and exercise, and trying to be organized about how you use your time so you don't have things pile up on you.
Yes.
And maintaining a kind of equanimity and training yourself in that through meditation or other techniques.
Beautiful. And you're really hitting on a number of things that the other speakers have talked about as well. At the end of the day, we're really looking at lifestyle medicine. We're looking at a lot of these changes within how we eat and how we live. Before we drill down deeper into those different facets that you just mentioned, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about autism. What happens with autism? What happens in the brain? What's going on there at more of a mechanistic level? Is there anything as it relates to toxicity that we should be discussing?
Yes. I have a new paper coming out. I just got the proofs about talking about autism as a process. People have thought about it as a kind of a state, a fait accompli of something you're stuck with, that's hardwired, that's stamped into your brain chips. I look at autism as something, as a set of, it's the way the brain creates behaviors when it has a very high total load and not enough resources. And the reason I think of it this way is that I hear from families, and I've seen with my own eyes, people having not only good days and bad days, but good minutes and bad minutes, depending sometimes on exposures. So that what I think happens is basically that the way the brain generates brain waves gets altered by the toxicity and by the depletion of our core physiology. So I'm going to have to spell that out, but it's a very different point of view, and I actually think it applies to the way our brain experiences stress more generally, but that autism is an extreme case. Honestly, I think that when you look at the way a lot of people act when they're really stressed out, they start to be rigid. They start to engage in repetitive behaviors. They repeat themselves. They don't listen. They don't look at you. You could call it stress. In a way, autism is an extreme form of stress, almost a qualitatively greater form of stress. When the cells in the brain don't have enough nutrients, don't have enough glutathione, don't have enough substrate to engage in protective processes. And by substrate, I basically mean nutrients and blood supply and fluids. The brain doesn't have, and also the energy supply. That's a really big deal, what the mitochondria do. When that system or set of systems starts to get inefficient, there's not enough juice for the brain to produce widespread coordination across its networks. Now, we know in autism that the networks tend to be underconnected. They're just not as well hooked up and not as complex, or sometimes they're overly hooked up, like in a seizure, but it's not as well regulated. And one of the main reasons I think for that is that the physiology is worn down, and one of the main things that's wearing it down, but not the only thing, is being toxic. So what you want to do to get over that is to build up the resources again, so the body's own ability and the brain's own ability to eliminate some of the total load can increase, and you can have more flexibility in the system again. And when the brain is more flexible, the behavior will be more flexible.
Exactly. And I really like what you said about autism, because it gives hope to people about the condition, right? Because, like you said, it's a condition within the brain that perhaps is designating that there are some wiring and some networks that need to be reassembled and realigned. Have you, in your own clinical practice, and I know that now you're doing much more in the way of research, but are there specific cases that you can speak to where you have actually seen autistic children transform and they start having great cognitive abilities and they're able to relate to others? Have you been able to actually witness this throughout your medical training?
Well, not through my training, through my extracurricular training. I actually did not witness that kind of thing in my formal mainstream medical training. But when I started getting out and about, I started finding other people who were getting people better, and I had some experience myself. And I should say that my book, The Autism Revolution, is based, it has 10 chapters, and 8 of those chapters are based around people who got better. And I tell the case stories of those people. There are lots of recovery stories on the internet. And what I'm working on, along with others, but I'm working on how do we document that, starting when the diagnosis happens and people start realizing that they have to do a systematic campaign to bring their child back. And yes, what happens is sometimes really interesting functions when you work with the whole body, when you use whole body strategies. So if you just train it behaviorally and you try to teach people skills without helping their bodily health, it's like trying to have a conversation when you only have 2 bars on your cell phone. You can say stuff over and over again, but the bottom line is it isn't going to get through. It isn't going to get heard. It isn't going to stick. But when you improve the whole person's health, what you're really doing is increasing the bars on the cell phone, in the sense that the brain becomes more receptive. It has more bandwidth to take in information, to integrate that information with other things, to generalize from it, and to remember and apply it to new things. So I think the most strategic thing to do is not to work at the level that our social brain sees, the behavioral. That's important to deal with, but to really make long-lasting progress, I think you need to go at the underlying levels of physiology, of bodily health, where the ways that the cells are able to function, and also at the level of movement organization, which is how the brain learns to think in the first place, even before you can talk or do deliberate social behaviors. I think we need to go under the surface and reorganize the physiological and motoric operating systems so that we can regain the flexibility. And in the case of autism, what's challenging is that autism is like many other chronic illnesses. The biology underneath it, the inflammation, the oxidative stress, the mitochondrial dysfunction, that's all the same, very close to the same.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts so early, it starts before the person has even had a chance to really experience a relatively unimpeded learning process. So what you have is a situation where a lot of things didn't get learned well in the first place. So you've got to improve the ability to learn, but then you've also got to give a lot of stimulation so that learning can be made up.
Well, I like what you said about reorganizing the operating system. in this technological age, I think that terminology really resonates with many people. So let's start doing that. Let's start talking about that, and let's focus on kids, because I'm assuming that many people listening are really concerned about the generations that have been born and those yet to be born. So let's talk about kids and food, because kids are notoriously picky eaters. They have sensory issues with food, especially kids with autism or behavioral issues and different symptoms. There are all kinds of food issues for us to take into account here. So what might be some strategies for moms and dads to be thinking about as it relates to food? What about, I remember reading in your book, you had a whole section on things like smoothies and purees and broths. How do we get the most nutrient density into the child without a lot of unpleasantness?
Yeah, I have a whole section in there on how to do that behaviorally.
Mm.
And I've actually learned more since. I'm working now as a consultant with the Center for Discovery in the Catskills, which is a residential facility for severe autism and severe medical developmental fragility. They have a biodynamic organic farm, and as the kids get well, they can work on it. So the food quality is very high because they eat the food they grow. And but when someone comes there who's really in serious trouble, it takes several months to even get them to eat the food. And that's a process of getting around the incredible sensory defensiveness, which is very extreme in autism, but you see it in a large number of other children, as you pointed out. I think that autism is just the end of a spectrum, and that spectrum goes way into the rest of the population. So, one of the things you need to do is not react negatively when they don't want to do what you want to do. Just don't, because that's a form of reinforcement. If they can kick a scene out of you, then that's almost a reinforcement for them. Mm-hmm. So if they don't do what you don't want to do, just don't react. Keep on persisting, but you want to get them to feel safe with the food. And the way children get safe with food, even bigger children who are having developmental issues, is to play with it and fiddle around with it, to put it in their hands, to put it on their face. So you have to have a certain tolerance. They're not going to act like little princesses or princes and sit down and have perfect table manners. Over time, you can transition them to a broader range of food. You can take them shopping and have them pick out different colors of vegetables so that they get interested in all the different colors of the rainbow, which have lots of nutrients in them. But you don't want to force them to eat it right away. Over time, when they get to play with the food, they'll become more interested in it. To create an atmosphere of safety and of many different ways of interacting with food can gradually lead a child to try things that they normally wouldn't get anywhere near. And I think it's really important because, another thing is that these children actually, in a way, they can learn to manipulate you. They're actually not dumb for the most part. And you need to be able to set limits without creating a big scene, because otherwise you're in this position where they're refusing to eat for reasons which aren't always good. One of the key tricks is actually changing the diet of the whole family to be the healthiest possible high nutrient density diet, including getting the gluten out of the house, having low glycemic index foods, low grain, eliminate sugar. These are the kinds of things that you can do. And actually, when you think about it, many adults also have a hard time learning new food habits. So we need to be compassionate about kids who also have a hard time, because honestly, a lot of adults take a while to learn new foods. I've found with people of all ages and abilities that the best thing is when people get interested in something new. So you're not just fighting with getting rid of the old, but you're creating a new focus of interest. Like my husband years ago when I first met him, he had high cholesterol. I got him really interested in making salads and salsas, and his cholesterol, just changing his diet like that after 9 months, went down 85 points.
Hmm.
He didn't do anything, no meds. Was just he started having a ball playing with vegetables. So I think it's important to look to the positive in the future in order to make change.
Well, my takeaway from what you're just saying is really, I'm going to put a little bit of a different spin on it, but it's almost like all those messages we might have heard growing up about our food and not playing with our food, that we have to reinvent that, and maybe playing with food and at least having fun at that dinner table is really the way to go. And I think perhaps some parents, there's no time to have fun with food. There's no time to play. We need to be proper and eat in certain ways. And of course, there's a time and a place to do that kind of a thing. But I really like what you're saying about playing and introducing things that are new and novel, that'll keep them engaged. So one other thing I have two questions that have come to mind based on the things that you were just saying. So you're talking about certain foods like no gluten, reduced sugar, and I definitely have been hearing that from other people that have been talking in the summit, like Dr. Perlmutter and Dr. Walls talked about sugar a bit and other things as well. What about soy? What about soy in kids? And is it really messing us up to have soy? And perhaps you can tell us about some of the research. Should we be seeing soy as a toxin?
Well, if it's not organic, I would certainly see it as a toxin. And I think that people were led to rely on it way too much. I'm not in a position to really say I don't eat it at all, except every now and then I have tempeh because it's fermented. I'm not clear that I can digest it very well, and I consider myself, if I can't do it, I would imagine a fair large amount of other people would have that problem. I think we have to think about our food like with gluten and various other foods. Some of these foods, and gluten in particular, they compromise the barriers in our body, the gut-blood and the blood-brain barrier. And so do toxins, and so does inflammation. And when you make those barriers leaky, it gets easier for toxicity to get in, and that drags down the system. So that doesn't answer your soy question, but I think it's something that people need to keep in mind, that when you start eating carelessly, you can be creating a more vulnerable ground for things that you're exposed to cause trouble. So part of eating well is to protect the integrity of the protective mechanisms of your system. And much of this nutritional advice is not just to get somebody to behave better if they avoid a food. Like if they don't have a reaction to that food, that doesn't mean it's safe. It just means that they aren't sick enough to feel the reaction. But it's still foods which have a risk profile still add to your total load. And you may not be near the edge of the cliff, but it puts you a little bit closer. And honestly, we have so many exposures that if you're feeling vulnerable at all, and probably many of the listeners are, or they wouldn't be on listening to this, you don't want to do anything to add further to the burden if you don't have to.
Exactly. Very well said. What about kids and dietary supplements? There are so many different supplements that are out there in the market, in the retail space, in the professional space. Sometimes we hear studies that tell us that supplements aren't good for us. Have they really been tested in children? So, do you look at the use of nutritional supplements in children, especially as it relates to certain nutrients that target the brain?
I do think there's a place for supplements. I mean, I have to say that I don't think there's a place for supplements as a first line. I would call it the second line after high nutrient density food. But there are people with either genetic vulnerabilities where they need extra supplement in order to carry out some functions that are slow in their systems. All those systems have taken a hit already from toxins, and they need some help to get better. And I think there's a place for it, and it needs to be done carefully and well, and the supplements should be high quality. We know there are problems with contaminants in poorer quality supplements. The stronger ends of the industry are working on setting higher standards. That's the same is true for herbs. Excellent herbs can help a lot, but you need to have quality control. That said, I think a lot of the noise in the press lately about supplements not doing anything is just a lot of nonsense. It's not based on any kind of careful look at the many, many thousands of papers showing important roles for nutrients and benefit for supplements used properly. If you're eating a bunch of junk food and you take supplements to make up for it, I don't think so. You really need to cover all your bases.
And what would be some of the common dietary supplements for something like autism? Like, what would you want to be repleting once you think that you've got a good nutrient dense foundation, but still want to see further improvement in the child? Uh, what would you be thinking about adding? And this is not prescriptive, it's just in general. What does the research
Sure.
show us? And,
Well,
what, yeah.
the first thing I would say is vitamin C, because human beings have a mutation so that we can't make enough on our own. So that's absolutely important. And you can tell if you brush your teeth and there's blood, or you can do an ascorbate flush to find out how much you need. But you really need a lot more than people tell you. Another thing is magnesium, because the large proportion of people in the United States are insufficient and many people don't absorb it very well. And you can take it orally or you can put it on your skin and with magnesium oil. A couple of other nutrients that are really important are zinc, which in people who are toxic tends to drop down and copper gets too high. And selenium and molybdenum are very important in detox processes, and many over-the-counter supplements don't contain enough of those. So you want to get a good quality supplement that contains these things. You can also add things like seaweed to food, to soup broths, because a lot of the sea vegetables contain a lot of different minerals that are helpful for detox. So that's a start there. Calcium, magnesium, zinc, vitamin C, precursors for glutathione like N-acetylcysteine, and folates, appropriate folic acid, which is not always obvious for a particular person. These things are important. Mothers who don't take folate-containing prenatal vitamins can have as much as a double the risk of autism. And if they have mutations in the one carbon pathways that are related to these nutrients, the risk can be sevenfold or even a lot more if they have several of these mutations. These mutations are pretty common in the population. So I think it's protective to help decrease the risk of having a child with autism in the first place and improve the health of the mother while she's nursing and of the baby and the toddler and the child with autism, or even the child who's showing signs of ill health before they're old enough to have autism. Too many ear infections, colic, diarrhea, sleep problems, irritability. All of these things are signs that the system is starting to go downhill and it's starting to be vulnerable. And if this goes on without going back to wellness, then any little thing might tip somebody over into a more autistic state. So there's a place for food and for supplements and probiotics and minerals, and backing off from the cliff of vulnerability toward better resilience.
So let me just do a quick recap there. You said vitamin C, magnesium, zinc, and then to watch the copper level because that might get too high just in toxicity. That zinc copper balance can be thrown off. Selenium, molybdenum, seaweed that we can add to broths because we can get a lot of minerals that way. Although I might mention here that seaweeds tend to sequester metals, and so we just have to be sure that we get a good source of seaweed.
Yeah, you don't want it from Fukushima.
No, you
It
don't
is a
want
problem.
exactly. You want a good, high quality, organic form of seaweed, and they do exist on the market. You mentioned precursors to glutathione, and so even things like broccoli and vitamin C can help with
Right.
glutathione production. You mentioned folates and probiotics. Now, one thing you did not mention, and I'm surprised, is omega-3 fats, or maybe
Oh,
I
of course,
missed
of
it.
course. Omega-3 fats are incredibly important, and people don't get enough of them. And it's a really big deal because your membranes and your brain are made of this stuff. So it's extremely important. And also, the cruciferous vegetables, the sulforaphane, That's been hard to get in high quality, but it's getting easier. All of these things can help. And a lot of these things you can get a lot of in high quality green smoothies. Any of the vegetables, like let's say, as an extreme example, cilantro, which is a detoxifying herb, if it's grown non organically, it's going to detox the soil. One of my dearest friends is a botanist who uses plants to detoxify contaminated wetlands. And, that's good to get the contaminants out, but then you still have the problem of what you do with them. And if you get foods that are grown on problem soils, and the bulk of our soils haven't been treated properly,
Mm-hmm.
then you really don't get better so well. There was an amazing quote in the book Clean on Detox by Junger, where he said we turn to vegetables to help us reduce our inflammation and get rid of our toxins. But if they haven't had the minerals they need because our soils have been so mineral depleted, except if they've been treated organically or biodynamically, then the plants are inflamed too. So we have a big challenge in raising, I really think that in many ways the foodies and the farmers who are wise to this are our future, because paying attention, learning again to have the highest nutrient density in everything, and knowing how these things interact is really our future. And when you get past the no matter how cynical you get, it's just impossible to keep up, to the point of realizing how many things we can do to help ourselves and how many things we can learn, it's really quite remarkable. And it becomes an incredible forward-looking adventure to learn all this stuff, because you can help yourself, you can help your family, and you can help other people. People need this. Everything we're saying applies to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
That the more you enrich the resources available, the more your brain is going to take advantage of the opportunities you provided to clean up its act and take out the trash. So remember that.
Absolutely. I think many of us haven't looked at the brain as an organ. We see it just kind of off on its own and it doesn't really have the same resiliency, but it really does, based on
Yep, it
everything that
does.
you're saying. So that's a very promising message to close on. So if we could just distill three very important messages from this interview today, what would those be in very short sound bites? What would you want to leave the listener with? What would the take action steps be, in your opinion?
The first one is to fall in love with learning about wonderful ways of playing with your high nutrient density food.
That's great. You got a lot of things in there.
Maybe that gets me off the hook for the other two. No, I mean, and really understand that your resiliency is the most precious thing, and make every choice a healthy choice.
Hmm.
You never know when something's going to come down the street and make it hard for you. Get hit by a bus. I mean, that's a metaphor in a way, because we need all the resiliency we can get in a toxic world.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Finally, really be forward looking, because that's the way to overcome stress. Keep your heart in the solutions, keep your vision on the solutions. Realize that, and there's a lot of company, and you can transform your life by following the light of what we can do to make ourselves healthy.
wow. Three very potent messages here. So I like what you said about the solutions, because oftentimes we get caught up in this web of fear that we're surrounded in a toxic environment.
I've been there too.
Yeah.
Like when you're sick, it's hard to do that, but I think it
Yeah.
really gets you better to look to the future.
It does, because our attitude changes the function of our immune system, right? And if our immune system is affected, our brain will be impacted.
I want to
So,
add one more thing. I forgot to say that when you sleep,
mhm.
the glial cells shrink and you dump out a lot of trash through the fluid channels in the brain. So
Yes.
don't forget to get a lot of sleep. It's very healing for the brain, and it actually allows brain trash collection, which is very important.
How many hours of sleep do you think that most people should be getting? Is it?
They should be getting more, usually I think somewhere between 8 and 9 is really good. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to think about what are you diddling around with to keeping you from being able to go to sleep.
Right.
And remember that when you do sleep, you're going to be much more efficient, and it really is an active detox to
Mm.
sleep.
I love that. I have never thought about sleep being an active detox, but it's very true. Even in traditional medicine, we hear about the importance of sleep and what do we eat when we first wake up after all that detoxing and how essential that is that we get a lot of phytonutrients in sooner rather than later. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Herbert, I mean, we're just spilling over here with all this information from you. I'm in very deep gratitude for everything that you've mentioned and all of the information that you've shared with us. These are really important points. I highly recommend people to buy Dr. Herbert's book, The Autism Revolution. And again, it's one of those books that I think spans different populations. If you're just interested in better brain health, I would read this book. And
Yeah.
what I like at the very end is that you have a whole section just based on resources, the go-to websites. And that's always a question, where do you go for credible information? You've got the references in here in case there are any science buffs that really want to go deeper into that. You have guides for parents, you have guides for practitioners and therapists and scientists. I mean, you have really cut across many different modalities and practitioners of all types. So I really commend you on what you've done with the Autism Revolution. And it's really been an honor to have you as part of the Detox Summit. Thank you
Let me
so
just
much.
mention, I have two websites, autismrevolution.org and autismwhyandhow.org if you want further information. And get on my newsletter lists and you'll be hearing from me. Not a lot. I don't overload. I don't too much, but you will.
And we will have your websites posted as part of the Detox Summit page. So don't worry if you didn't catch those websites. We will have them available for you. And great. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. And it's been a joy.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, Deanna.